good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this year's Tanner Lectures on the human values. We have a truly spectacular setting for the lecture today, so thank you to the folks who made Denning House available to us. And this is going to be distracting, Nick, to have to look out over the lake on a beautiful day like today. I wanted to start by saying a few things about the Tanner Lecture series, which some of you may know the history of the Tanner Lectures, which are one of the most distinguished academic lecture series that exists anywhere. The Tanner Lecture series was established almost 50 years ago by Obert Clark Tanner, who was a scholar. He was a businessman, and he was a philanthropist. He actually had very deep ties to Stanford. He was a student here in the 1930s. He got a master's degree in philosophy. And then he stayed here at Stanford after he got his degree, and he taught religious studies from 1939 until 1944. And he was actually the chaplain of Memorial Church during that time. He then went back to Utah and started the O.C. Tanner Company, which, if any of you are Stanford staff members, every time there is someone hits a 20-year milestone, you will be prompted by the O.C. Tanner message to fill in a little card for the person who's been here for 20 years. So that is the O.C. Tanner, part of the O.C. Tanner business. They also make commemorative types of things. Anyway, we had a very successful company, and Obert and his wife, Grace, used some of their material success from that company both to support things at Stanford, like the Tanner Fountain, which is between Memorial Auditorium and Hoover Tower and the Tanner Memorial Library of Philosophy, and to create the Tanner Lectures. And there are 9 institutions in the US and the UK that host the Tanner Lectures. And the lectures are quite wide-ranging, actually. They all have an emphasis on human behavior and human values. But the set of people, if you look, who have been asked to give the Tanner Lectures, both at Stanford and around the world, in the UK and our peer institutions in the US, span just about every academic discipline. And that's a very special thing to do. And often, the Tanner Lectures are academics and scholars who work in one discipline, but whose work stretches very far beyond their home discipline. And Professor Nicholas Stern falls squarely into that category. So let me say a few things about Nick. Nick is based at the London School of Economics, where he is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government. He's the chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. He is the chair of the LSE's Global School of Sustainability. He is well known for his work in public economics, in development economics. He's served as the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He's worked at the World Bank. He's been very active in both national, UK, and global policy. He is particularly esteemed for the work he did leading the UK Government Economic Service. In that capacity, he produced the famous Stern Review on the economics of climate change, which helped to basically set the intellectual framework for thinking about climate change for the last 20 years, and has had just a profound impact on both policy and on scholarly thinking. He has many distinctions, including becoming Sir Nicholas Stern, receiving a knighthood in 2004, and then becoming a life peer in 2007. He's published more than 25 books, more than 200 articles, and his most recent book is The Growth Story of the 21st Century, which was published just last year. And he is going to speak to us this afternoon about how economics can guide our thinking about systems, structures, and technologies to address climate change and biodiversity loss, and help to chart a hopefully optimistic path toward the future. Following Professor Stern's remarks, we're going to hear a response and discussion from Heather Boucher. Professor Boucher is a leading voice at the intersection of economic inequality, growth, and public policy. She's professor of the practice at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a non-resident fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. In the Biden administration, she served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, and she was the chief economist to the president's Invest in America cabinet. And she has written extensively about economic inequality, among other topics. She'll speak after Professor Stern. There'll be some Q&A after that will be moderated by Leif Wennar, who's the faculty director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society. Before I close, I want to just thank the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society, which hosts this event at Stanford, the Tanner Lectures Steering Committee, and the O.C. Tanner Foundation, which made this event possible. And thank you in particular to Professor Stern and to the scholars who will be in conversation with him today and then tomorrow for the second part of the lectures. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Nick Stern.
Thank you so much, John. That very kind introduction and your part of your office in inviting me. And thank you so much to the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society and all involved. Leif, Anne, and Sabrina have made everything so easy and cheerful in getting ready for this event. And thank you also for choosing 3 really splendid discussants. And I'm really looking forward to those interactions. And an academic has a good day if she or he learns something, and I'm sure I'm going to learn something during the course of these next 2 days. I'm going to speak to slides. There is a text, but I get boring if I just read out stuff. So I try to put it in the form of slides, and I'll go back to the text after all the interactions here. The slides will be available through the video of all this. The slides will come with it, so they are, as it were, absolutely in the public domain. And if you do want to refer to the book that John so kindly mentioned, it's published by LSE Press, and the crucial thing there is that it's open access. You can download it for free. There's a bit of a problem with the revenue model for a press that operates like that, but that's the way we do it. That's I think of real value. Now, I'm going to talk about the economics and ethics that, in my view, are necessary for a serious discussion of the immense challenges of climate change. And a big part of what I want to say is that the way you pose the questions in the ethics depends on your understanding of the structure of the problem. And those questions will look different if you structure the basic mechanics of the problem in different ways. And similarly, the mechanics of the problem, how it works, will affect the economics you bring to the table. And I have chastised, and I'll continue chastising, some of my profession in the way they set up the problem in the first place. Happily, that's changing and moving on, but we did get locked into what I thought was a pretty unhelpful description of the structure of the problem, and of course it led to misplaced structure of the ethics as well. And both those, of course, the economics and the ethics, which are based on the structure of the problem, feed directly into the politics and the political economy that comes with it. You can't discuss this issue, and John was very clear on that, you can't discuss this issue without thinking about the basic science, the technology, the economics, the ethics, the politics, and so much more, the economic history and the international relations and so on. It's not because you're trying to bring lots of stuff in, it's because the problem demands that you do. So that's in a sort of a big picture story of what I want to say. Of course, within it, the detail, I hope, is going to matter. So let me describe the structure of the story. So today, I'm going to go through the first two parts. The first part is the structure of the problem. What does the science tell us that the problem really is? What has economics brought? And perhaps that'll open up my discussion of what economics should have brought to the problem. And of course, the technology is vital. And all of this comes through investment. You don't run down the old until you've built the new. You don't get innovation that's outside investment. It's embodied in investment. Investment's going to be at the heart of the story. So that's the basic structure of the problem. And then the second part, growth and public action, will be the response. And I'll argue that the kinds of investments we need to make are going to drive the growth story of the 21st century. And that's the core argument of the economic side of the lecture. But of course, investments don't happen without circumstances for those investments. The investment climate is crucial, the public policy is crucial, the institutional structures that give confidence or lack of confidence in the public policy shapes investment as well. So that's so I'll describe what I think the economics of climate change should be about. And a good bit of that's actually a research agenda. And this is a classic problem for any of us who've been involved in public policy, is that you have to make up your mind and give advice based on what you think you know. At the same time, you know that what you think you know is inadequate in some basic sense. And so you have to think and act at the same time. That's the joy and challenge of being involved in policy making. I mean, Heather's done exactly that. You can't say, wait until I've finished the research grant, and after 3 years, your report says what we need is more research. So it's, policy has to be made today. So I'll try to do both there. And of course, a lot of this is going to be about the role of the state. This cannot be an inactive state. If you're trying to move as a society investment in this direction, and we know what this direction looks like, you can't say just, well, the state's got to step back. It can't, because you're trying to shift. At the same time, not all of the investment, a big part of this investment is going to be in the private sector. So it's a question of how those incentive structures and confidence in them gets put in place. So that's what I'll try to get through today. I'll have to move fairly quickly, but just as a quick trailer for tomorrow, at the beginning of tomorrow, I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so focused entirely on the ethics of this story. Much of what I have to say today will essentially adopt the standard consequentialist approach to ethics, which we use in economics. It's mostly about cost-benefit, who gains, who loses. And of course, you've got to take a long run, short run, both view of this. But it's basically consequentialist. You say, how does this policy affect different people in different ways? And then you aggregate that up in some way that gives you a decision. But of course, we know that, and we should, I hope, know that ethics is so much more than that. And the thing I'll emphasize, particularly going beyond the consequentialist approach, is the notion of rights, and in particular, the right to development. What Amartya Sen speaks about as the ability to pursue a life you have reason to value. Or, you talk in the American Constitution, the American Declaration of Independence, persuasively about the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, and that's a basic rights approach, steeped in that century, associated with Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, and so on. I will argue that the ethics that I find most productive of this problem is the combination of consequentialism and a rights-based story. But of course, ethics is, and I'm sitting in a room full of serious moral philosophers here, it's much more than that. And the great religions have a lot to say, the great philosophers, or the great philosophies have a lot to say. I'll be a little bit cavalier with those, but I don't want to leave them out. I mean, I don't want to look as if, or be a person who ignores what the great philosophies and the great religions have to say on this, but it'll be super fast. But it's a sort of note not to be forgotten. And I will argue that most of the approaches to the ethics of all this lead in one direction, and that's strong action on climate change. And we are in a hurry, as I'll argue through the thing. The next 20 years are absolutely vital. They will see that the infrastructure that India will have, the country where I've worked for much of my life, the infrastructure they will have in mid-century, well over half will be built between now and then, between 2026 now and 2050. What that looks like will shape the world. And of course, the same is true for Indonesia and Asia and Africa and so on. So that's what I'll be arguing tomorrow. So let's move fast now. This is a serious science-based university. I'm not going to talk about the science of climate change. Those of you who are here should know about it. If you don't, I encourage you to look at the website of the Royal Society in the UK or the National Academy of Sciences in the US. But we all know that greenhouse gases oscillate in a way that interfere with the escape of infrared from the atmosphere. The more of the greenhouse gases are there, the more is the trapping effect. That's why we call it the greenhouse effect. And as concentrations go on rising, temperatures go on rising. And temperatures stop rising when you get to net zero, and where sources and sinks balance each other out. You know, just like the bathtub has a level at which is constant, you know, when the taps and the exit from the bath are going at the same rate. So that's a very simple story. The earlier you get to net zero, the lower the temperature at which you stabilize. Now, there are lots of subtleties in the science, but that's the basic story. If you look at articulated policies in the world, or as they are currently set, we're going to end up by end of century somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees. We haven't been at 3 degrees for perhaps 3 million years. And we're already outside the Holocene period when we became, as it were, settled farmers and so on. Grasses changed to wheat and cereals and so on. We're already substantially outside that. That's plus or minus 1. We're at 1.4 or so degrees centigrade now. So 3 degrees would be enormously dangerous in ways that I'll just have to describe very quickly. But if you think of what the consequences of that would be, think of the extreme weather events, think of desertification, think of flooding, think of what happens when you lose the snow and the ice off the Himalaya. Think of how if the land-based ice at the 2 poles started to go, you'd see very quick sea level rise in contrast to thermal expansion, which is quite a slow process. And probably if we are reckless or negligent in all this, you would see hundreds of millions of people in the second part of this century, perhaps billions of people on the move, because where they live just becomes essentially uninhabitable. On top of that, you've got tipping points, and the tipping points are associated with, for example, the collapse of the Amazon forest, or the thawing of the permafrost, the loss of the coral. And all these effects could start to kick in at temperatures which are not so very different from where we are now, and in the ranges that we're talking about here. So if you look at you all know about, I'm not going to come to California and tell you about LA fires, but that's the kind of thing that happens, yeah? And if you look at this graphic on the right-hand side there, you will see that if we are negligent, if we don't act very strongly, by 2070, around 3.5 billion people could be living at basic temperatures associated with the Sahara. And that's not a very sensible place to be. People will move on a big scale. So if you think of the effects of migration, of climate on migration that we see already, in the words of Ronnie Reagan, you ain't seen nothing yet. And if you are interested and worried about immigration, then you ought to be interested and worried about climate. There are better reasons for, not better, there's so many other reasons for being worried about climate, but immigration, if that's what worries you, should take you into climate action. I wonder how much it will. The more we look at the science, the worse it gets, and this is the last bit I'll do on the science story. Essentially, what we thought as likely areas where which would be trigger points for these kinds of tipping and unstable structures, when we did the Stern Review 20 years ago, we had access only to the third report of the IPCC and the assessment report. Now we've got 6, the 7th is on the way, and essentially what we thought would be the areas where these tipping points might start to be really troublesome, we thought about 4 degrees centigrade. We now think 2 or 2.5 degrees centigrade. Every time you look at the science, it gets worse. And of course, I'll emphasize in a moment that every time you look at the technology, it looks better. So it's a paradox that we seem to be struggling a bit with pushback on climate exactly at the moment when the science is ever more worrying and the technology gives you ever more opportunities. This is the moment when we should be doubling down big time. Now, the economics, I'll have to go very fast here. How many people in the room are economists? They're all over here. Anyway, well, maybe some of you could have been. That was your choice. But so I'll try not to dwell too heavily. But there are key parts of this where, obviously I am an economist, where I think the economics really matters. So what did the economists start to do? Well, they woke up. Reasonably early. There's a problem here, right? And we are doing things which are making life more difficult for ourselves because they're causing climate change. How do we think about that? Well, we build an aggregate growth model, and we suppose that it, carries on like aggregate growth models do, with a growth rate which we call exogenous, fixed outside the model. And we think, there are going to be some perturbations here as a result of some losses as a result of this climate change stuff. And we'll just try to fit those losses into the model, and we'll ask how much should we invest less as a result. Bill Nordhaus called his first famous paper, to slow or not to slow. The trouble was that they built into these models not only the constant growth rate, when we know that climate change now could absolutely disrupt and reverse, but they also built in very modest effects. Losses of output of 4 or 5 degrees at 5 degrees centigrade. Well, if you're going to get to 5 degrees centigrade 100 years from now, and your growth model tells you you're going to be much far better off, factors of 2 and 3, why bother about 5% loss? You build in a structure where you know what the answer is going to be, because it shrieks at you straight from the assumptions. And certainly, on top of that, they had very high costs of action, weak technical progress. And crucially for action, they were aggregate models. They missed out the whole story of technical structural change, which was a big part. So they were actually designed, A, to give very relaxed answers about temperature, and B, they were designed to leave out everything that really matters about structural, systemic, technological change. So they got the answers that were built into them and were, blinding. You all know, who watches John Cleese in the... Please? Not very many of you. He has this category called the blindingly obvious, but the consequences of these models is blindingly obvious from the assumptions. So a bad start. There was another one which is, so that hang on, sorry. Yeah, so this is what I've just been describing about the problems with the models. Another one, and this was that greenhouse gases are an externality. If I emit greenhouse gases, I make life worse for other people. And there's a standard and healthy and strong piece of economics associated with Pigou 100 or so years ago, which says that if people are not facing the costs of their actions, they do too much of that. And so you charge them, and that's the carbon price and the carbon market, and it makes eminent economic sense. The problem is that many economists spoke as if that was the only thing you had to do, and there are a whole slew of other externalities which are vital here. R&D and capital markets, a lot of what we're talking about works through networks and systems. And networks and systems need government actions to function properly, because the functioning of one part of the network will depend on what people do elsewhere, and so on. Big issues around information and what economists often call co-benefits, which is sort of slightly flat word, but sink of air pollution. We kill, through air pollution, 5 to 10 million people a year in a world where we probably have 60 million or so deaths a year. That's big. 5 or 10 million deaths from air pollution in a world with 60 or so million deaths a year. And not all of it, not all the air pollution comes from burning fossil fuels, but a lot of it comes from burning fossil fuels. And that doesn't count all the maiming. Now, I hope we would be against, of course, the maiming and deaths, because we're against maiming and deaths, but it also doesn't do much for productivity and growth. So I'm going to spend just a moment on discounting, and I'm going to be quick because it's slightly nerdy, but not very. And it was a big part of the early discussions of the work. Discounting says that you attach a lower weight to something that happens in the future than relative to now. So why would you do that? Well, the first and obvious answer is that if you think people down the track are going to be better off than people now, then you, and this is an ethical position, you would, for that reason, because they're better off, think of an extra dollar to them is worth less than an extra dollar now, because the people now are less well off than people then. And I think it's an ethical position, but it's one I think that most people, certainly I would want to take. And the next part of the story is do you discount people simply because they're born in the future? Now, I think most people should answer that, and it's a moral position, should answer no. If you take two people totally identical in everything that's relevant, except that one happens to be born 20 years later, why would you treat that person any differently? And treating them differently is called pure time discounting. And many of us have struggled, and we can't find a good argument for doing that, because there isn't a good argument for doing that. So that's the story of discounting. And then the discount rate is the rate of fall of this factor I've just described. The factor is the weighting of the extra unit in the future relative to now. The discount rate is the logarithmic rate of fall, the proportional rate of fall of that discount factor. That's the basic theory of discounting, yeah? And it's not complicated, and it does depend on ethical positions, but crucially, it depends on assumptions about what the future is going to look like. Well, what we do now, particularly around climate change, has a profound effect on what the future's going to look like. And so you cannot haul in some number from outside, for example, from the capital markets, and say that's our social discount rate. It's a complete misunderstanding. Now, Bill Nordhaus is a scholar and a gentleman and a friend, but I think I'm going to use this quote from him to illustrate how you can get these things wrong. Now, Bill did a review of the Stern Review, and he said the review's unambiguous conclusions, it's nice to have unambiguous conclusions, the review's unambiguous conclusions about the need for extreme immediate action will not survive the substitution of assumptions that are consistent with today's market price, real interest rates, and savings rates. That's wrong in so many ways, right? The markets tell us nothing about social values. They are the outcome of people's private transactions. Why would you attach a moral significance to what happens in the markets? Is it extreme to turn away from a cliff edge when actually there's a much better route? That doesn't sound extreme to me. You have to invest quite a lot to do it, but it's perfectly within our capabilities. Can you import social discount rates from outside? I've just explained why you can't for the purpose of climate change. So it was just a misplaced story, and showing, I think, how the disassociation of serious ethics and modern public economics from so much of economics has led to difficult conclusions. And lastly, as the science gets ever more worrying, we realize that the discounting does matter, but overwhelmingly it's the risks that we face that shape what we should do. It's not that discounting is irrelevant, it's that every time you look at the science it gets worse, the risks get bigger, and it's that's the primary focus for action. I'm going to be very quick on this. Every time you look at the technology, it gets better. So here are the graphs. It's just been crashing down. You remember Jimmy Carter put the photovoltaic sort of things on top of his panels on top of the White House. Well, I think they would cost something like 1,000th now than they cost Jimmy. It is just unbelievable. And particularly, you had very strong falls in the last 20 years or so. Similarly with batteries. What's coming? Well, these things, you get to tipping points of a good kind when the new stuff gets really attractive. It gets affordable, it gets attractive, and it gets accessible. I mean, synthetic protein, whether it's attractive or not, is a big deal. But with electricity, what matters is it cheap and is it reliable? And that's, so what we're seeing now is on the electric side with the batteries and the solar panels and so on, we're seeing the rapid growth. And something like 90% of the investment in the last year or so on electric capacity around the world has been in renewables. People are not in. I mean, there is investment, of course, in the fossil fuel electricity generation, but it's very small now, and that's a reflection of just how cheap it's come. There are other places like aviation fuel, right down over on the left-hand side, or cement and so on, where there's a really long way to go, a really long way. So what we're going to see in a world which is developing is that some parts of it, the clean is much cheaper than the dirty. Actually, the bigger part of emissions, the clean is cheaper than the dirty. Not yet, but not so far away. But there will be some bits that will be more expensive. But the bits that will be cheaper will overrun the bits that are more expensive. And more fundamentally, going after the new sources of energy and so on and is going to give you a new growth story. There's a dynamics there. It's not just a simple cost-benefit comparison in a static sense. I'll come to that very shortly. Economic geography is going to change. When I was at school, we were taught about why Manchester and Newcastle were where they were. Well, it's because steel was important, and there's the iron ore and the coal, and they're jolly heavy things, so people move to where the iron ore and the coal are. Well, the geography of energy is changing dramatically. The big low cost of energy is in the Sun Belt, and 50% of it's in Africa. Something like 70% of it's the global south. That's going to have a profound effect on economic geography and international relations, particularly where it's near minerals. And you have to invest a lot to make it happen. I haven't got time to go through these numbers, but I did want to emphasize that those numbers are quite big. Talking about in the world as a whole, something like an extra 2-3 percentage points of investment in order to get where you need to go. Big part of it, of course, in the energy transition, but there's adaptation, there's the natural capital, and so on as well. So you have to invest a lot to get there. But it's, we used to invest. Investment rates have gone down. We used to invest a few percentage points more than we do. It's perfectly possible to make that happen. These are numbers that with Amar Bhattacharya and Veera Songwe, we were working on climate finance and how much climate finance you need, and we approached that from the point of view, well, how much investment do you need? How much investment can be financed internally and externally? I haven't got time to go through that. But I do want to emphasize very strongly this point here. There is no separation, in my view, between climate action and development. This is about investment for good development. And wherever you look on energy, adaptation, these are investments that make sense and are highly correlated or highly associated with good investment. And finally, the story of the relationship between the green and the AI. And this intersection is going to be enormously powerful. And one piece of luck, we had lots of bad luck about the basics of climate change, but one piece of good luck is that the AI has come along at the right time to help us, because so much of this is about the management of systems big systems. The cities, the energy, the transport, the land, and the water. And we're going to have to redesign those things. It's to be a big part of the growth story that I'm about to come to. Discovery, we know that AI is very important in discovery. I mean, new materials, new ways of doing things, and so on. So that's, and understanding adaptation and resilience is also a major element in all this. So I've tried to set out the structure of the problem, and there you are. You've got the science, you've got the economics, which I think we now have to recast, and you've got the technology. And it's this structure that determines the economics we should use and the ethics. So let me go to the growth story of the 21st century. I argue that there are 6 big drivers of growth. I've already mentioned the lower cost in the innovation. Increasing returns to scale is a big part of that story. Standard economic general equilibrium models can't handle increasing returns to scale, which is one reason why we have to look at these things in a different way. Efficiency is productivity. Efficiency, a more efficient economy is a more productive economy in terms of how you use your resources, and a more productive economy should give you stronger growth. The most important thing, I think, I've already emphasized, is the system productivity. Cities where you can move and breathe are more productive than cities where you can't. Energy systems and transport systems can be made much more efficient by restructuring, particularly around the new technologies. It's an area where the intersection between the AI and the green is strong. I've already emphasized improved health. I've worked much of my life in India. 94 of the 100 worst polluted cities from the point of view of air are in India. I mean, Indian babies in Delhi smoke the equivalent of 20 or 30 cigarettes a day. And the loss of life, as I've already emphasized, is horrific. But it's clearly a major productivity issue as well. And I've emphasized that the world as a whole probably have to increase its investment rates by 2 or 3 percentage points. That itself will drive growth. Those of you who like your economic macro models will notice that it's only the last of these things that I've mentioned get into a standard macroeconomic model. And they're the heart of the story. So I've gone through those driving forces, and I've already said the way in which they drive the growth. It's also so what I've said is that there is no horse race between climate action on the one hand and growth on the other. I've also emphasized that when I'm talking about growth, it's a rather different story from the dirty, destructive models of the past. It's a much cleaner, more attractive story of growth. I'm not talking about growth forever. It's very difficult to understand what growth forever means. I'm talking about the next 20 or 30 years and the investments that are associated with that, and how productive those investments will be, not only in terms of conventional output, but in health and the way we live and the way we live in relation to our environment and the kinds of cities that we live in and so on. I also want to emphasize that there's no horse race between adaptation and mitigation. There's no horse race between cutting back on emissions and using your investment resources for adaptation. Public transport is good for development, it's good for reducing emissions, and it's good for resilience. So too are mangroves. They're very good at capturing carbon, actually, mangroves, and of course there are defenses against storm surges, restoring degraded land, and so on. Not everything you do is mitigation, adaptation, development, but so much of it is. I've given the positive story, why it's a growth story, but at the same time you have to dispose of some of the people who would argue that it's obviously going to be climate action will kill growth. You hear it all the time, including, you know where you hear it all the time. But in a world that's inefficient, in a world that's profoundly inefficient in the ways that we've already described in terms of the market failures, it's not true that if you add an extra criterion, you have to give up on something else. You have to be smart at dealing with the inefficiencies, but that's exactly the kind of policies which we're having. There's another one that says development needs energy and energy needs carbon. The first part of the story is true, the second part of the story is false. So in the book at some length, I deal with the, as it were, the bad arguments. I'm also noting here, but perhaps we can discuss it when we come to questions, that it's a growth story, not a degrowth story. It is not a degrowth story. You don't get to net zero with zero population or zero output. Well, at least I hope not. You get to it by breaking the relationship between the way we do things and the damage to the environment. That's the big story. And there you go. The new economics. I've already given some of it. But what we've got to do is to drive the structural and systemic change that I've been describing, and we've got to do it quickly. This is economic policy as if time matters. Those of you, this is the economics on this side here. A lot of our discussions of economic policy say, here's my model and its equilibrium with this policy. Here's my model and its equilibrium with that policy. I compare the two, and if one looks better, then I go for that one. Time doesn't matter in that kind of story. Time matters crucially in this story. So it has to be economics as if time matters. It has to be economics with a broad range of objectives. I think mostly, to be fair to our profession, we do have a broad range. The idea of the economist is interested only in GDP is a caricature, but we have to emphasize the broad range of objectives and the broad range of investments: physical, human, natural, and social capital. I've already emphasized the dynamics of change, the whole range of market failures. I'll allude to it in just a moment. But it's not just, as I've emphasized already, the first on the list of market failures is the greenhouse gas, and that's the first on the list of policies, is the price for carbon. But these others are not small, and I'll return to that in just a moment. Of course, behavior is going to matter a lot, and I haven't got time to go into this, but the economics of extreme risk sits rather badly in the kind of expected utility frameworks that we generally use in economics. So this is the story of sustainable development. Sustainability is offering to the future generations opportunities at least as good as this one, assuming they behave in the same way to those that follow. It's actually, and you've got a school of sustainability, and we've got a school of sustainability. I actually prefer sustainable development. To leave the air pollution in Delhi for your children just the same as the air pollution in Delhi now doesn't sound to me like a great gift. It's sustainable development. We want to build up, we want to drive forward in a way that makes lives better off for those people that follow us. And that's sustainable development, which is a stronger notion, but of course sustainability is a necessary condition for that. Investing in physical, human, natural, and social capital. So this is a story of growth that looks very different in terms of its objectives and its means and its understanding of policies than the dirty, destructive models of the past. I've already emphasized more than one market failure. This is in part our policy agenda. You've got to deal with the greenhouse gas externality, number one on the list. But R&D is a big part of the story, and that's why you've got the Durr School of Sustainability. You're trying to drive forward the new technologies that we need and how they can actually be used. Imperfections in capital markets are crucial. Most of what we do for example, in renewable energy is capital up front, saving for the, it might be 10 minutes if that's go up, but keep at me, yeah, okay? So you've got the R&D, you've got the capital markets. The cost of capital is crucial. You're having capital up front to save all those, inconvenient, dirty inputs down the track. The cost of capital is critical, and there's so much we can do to overcome the imperfections in the capital markets. A lot of scope, for example, for development banks, for government guarantees and so on, to really bring down that cost of capital. You used to do that in the United States. The networks, and a big part of the story as well, I've already emphasized. Each of these has a natural policy element to it. So that's part of the agenda, research agenda, and the action agenda. Governments need to be convincing over time. If you're making a 20 or 30-year investment, then you have to think something about policy and prices and demands and costs and so on over 20 or 30 years. So the credibility of government policy is crucial. In these areas, I've used or trying to coin a phrase which is predictably flexible. In monetary policy, on the whole, we have an understanding of what it means to be predictably flexible. You change the monetary policy according to certain guidelines. People know what they are. So if they can predict whether, and they do predict, whether you're going to change it or not. That should be true about so much of the economic policy here. It's good that it's there in monetary policy. It's an example, but that should be very strong right through what we do. And you're going to need institutions to help you do that, just as you need independent central banks to help you do that on monetary policy. I haven't got the time to go into immense risks, but the dear friend, the late Marty Weitzman, was onto that right at the beginning of all this discussion. He said, if you have infinite damages, you're going to have infinite prices, and something's gone wrong here because you're not going to have infinite price. So the way in which we understand and deal with immense risk in economics is a very important area for research. Now, this is the last part of what I want to say today. So I've emphasized that this has to be an active state, and I'll come back to that tomorrow, because you're trying to change the shape of development. You're trying to guide the policy. You're trying to build new cities. You can't redesign a city just with a carbon price. You need a much more active set of policies than that. You're trying to push investment in new directions. So this is going to have to be an active state. That doesn't mean that the activities are nationalized. It means that the incentive structures are set by government to push investment in a direction which we now know is crucial. Public discussion of that story is absolutely crucial, both in thinking in terms of what we understand by democracy, but also in terms of acceptance and getting things done. We know the political economy is not going to be easy. The vested interests, are very good at pushing back on this whole story. That has to be a public discussion and challenge. There'll be other people who are not simply characterized as the people who are living on the rents of the fossil fuels. If you're a coal miner and you lose your job, you've got a problem. And if you've got lots of coal miners in the same place all losing their jobs, that place has a big problem. There's a duty, and then Heather's worked a lot on this kind of thing, there's a duty to invest in people and places that are affected by the public policies which we together have chosen. And that's a very big part of the story. So managing dislocation, I think for those who are displaced in that way of the displaced coal miner, is very different from managing the dislocation from somebody who's a bit cross that the rents from oil and gas are not quite as big as they hoped that they would be. This is a very big part of the role of the state. I emphasize the growth theory. A lot of the early discussion in the international gatherings around climate change were essentially about burden sharing. This is all big costs, it's all getting in the way of development, who's going to pay, who's going to sort it out, unless you give us the money, we're not doing anything. If this is a story which is a new story of growth, that discussion changes. It'll change the ethics, as I'm going to argue tomorrow, that the ethics become, given that much of this is in our self-interest in a very direct way, and given that we're all affected by the outcomes, if that's the story, if it is really a growth story and there's no serious trade-off between climate action and growth and development, then the ethical problem becomes how we help each other realize this new growth story. It's not the story of this is a big burden, you've got to pay for it. And it changes the politics. It changes the politics from being divisive, which is the burden sharing, to being actually collaborative and finding ways to do that. So it's a very big part of the politics as well as a very big part of the ethics. And finally, here's, that's my mate Mark Carney down there. I'm just going to talk about Brexit, and you can make your own analogies. Yeah. There were 3 questions in Brexit. Are you angry? Is it the fault of elites? And is it the fault of foreigners? Yes, yes, yes. Vote Brexit. There are analogies elsewhere. People were angry. They were angry. They weren't randomly angry. They had a serious grouse. A lot of people in an economy that was growing extremely slowly, and some people were getting much better off, a lot of people were getting worse off. They were angry. It wasn't that they were just grumpy people. They had reasons to be grumpy. That's why I think the growth story is such an important element of all this. And I've argued it's an economic imperative, I'll argue it's an ethical imperative. I essentially have, but I'll develop that tomorrow. I also think it's a political imperative. We have to get growth going, but this is the central way that we get growth going. We have to get growth going in a way that brings as many people as possible. And I think this story does bring as many people as possible into that growth story. And that's why I think it's a political imperative as well. So let me stop there. Sorry, that was 5 minutes over? Okay, well, you're in charge, right? Okay, all right. But thank you all very much. I'm looking forward very much to what Heather has to say. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. That was fantastic. I am very pleased to be able to offer a brief set of remarks here, although, as I knew would happen, I have kept writing down more things that I want to say about the speech. So we will see. But I'm going to try to do my notes in the order that I prepared them, and then we'll come back to a few things, because I want to actually, at some point, talk about pure time discounting. So let me just start off by giving just a brief, the perspective that I want to take on the speech and on the work. I have long been inspired by your work. I feel that it was, part of the body of work that inspired what we did in 4 years of the Biden administration, where we were focused on creating a new economic model that was grounded in building a clean energy economy. And I'm going to speak 100% from the perspective of someone who has spent their career, and particularly the 4 years before the last, 18 months or however this torment has been, focused on America's middle class. And when I say middle class, I mean people who work for a living. The 80% of us that get 80% of our income from holding down a job, right? So that's, when I say middle class, that's what I mean. It's an American kind of definition. And I appreciate, and I'm going to come at the end of my notes on some of the development aspects in other countries, but I want to talk about what these ideas mean for the United States, just to bound it a little bit, although there is so much to talk about here. So in large part, I think this is a really important speech. I recommend you all read it and study it. And my comments are going to be about twisting the dial a little bit. Most of my comments are, some of them are big quibbles, little quibbles, but it's about kind of taking the argument to its logical conclusion. And I'm excited for tomorrow's conversation about the ethics, but I think that the way that you state it, that it is about the right of people to have development, that I think is really important. And one of the things that when I think about the right of a community, the right of people to have development, that isn't an individual ask. That is an ask about a community. It's about a place on a particular plot of land in the world, in the United States somewhere, where this place is asking for a model of economic growth that they have some agency over and that is beneficial to them. And I'm an economist, but when we do economics, we don't think in large part about community or about units. We think about the individual. And so as I want to just twist the dial a little bit, a few clicks, taking your ideas about growth and making it apply to how we think about moving systems, not just changing individual behavior. And I think, and sometimes when we start talking about market failures, it becomes about these, you've rejected marginalism, but there's still a little bit of that in there. So a lot of my comments are kind of in that framework. And apologies, I'm speaking like an economist, and I know most of you are not. So we can also,
You have to look over there.
Yeah, I know. Hi, you're my audience over here. No, I don't think that's true. So because I know you're going to start with the time thing, let me just get all three of the points I want to make out, and then I have a bunch of follow-on comments that I want to get to on all of them. So first, where you, Professor Stern, start with emissions, and you did this great introduction about climate change, very bad, emissions, very bad. I think that if you think that it is a growth pathway, we have to start with the economy. And so I would start the question, which is, how is this going to deliver for the middle class, given my definition? Who is the economy for, and why? And that gets to the second comment I want to make, which is that We have a growth model, and that's literally what got us here, right? It is, the way that our economies have developed is grounded in a set of decisions about what kind of energy to use. This is a conversation that's been going on for a very long time, and it is foundational to why some countries have grown and why others haven't. This is the source of our wealth, is our ability to harness power. And so it is so core and fundamental to our theory of economic growth. And so I think as we're thinking about a new growth model, we really have to confront who is our economy for, and what do we make, and how do we make it, and how is that connected to how we're going to power our economy. And then my third comment is, yes, I think, and we talked about this over dinner, you mentioned a little bit up here, that when we say development, so often we're thinking about less developed countries, and that is very important. And I think that every country and every community should have the right to develop. But I have spent my entire life on this planet where I have been conscious of what is happening to our economy in a world where the economy has not been delivering development for the majority of people in these great United States. And that is a political problem, it's an economic problem, and fundamentally it's an emissions problem. And so I think that I want us to center what's happening here, because I also think, if I could be so bold, and this is a week where I think I can say this very boldly, what happens here in the United States and how toxic our political environment becomes has implications for people all over the world. And so I think it is not anti-other countries to say we have to care about America's middle class too. It's just as important. So I will come back to that one, but that is most of what I want to say on that third point. So there's no time up here yet, so good, I have a lot. So on to my first point. I agree, we are at this massive inflection point, and I think that, one of the most, as I'm thinking about the economy, and I'm thinking about how we build a clean energy economy here in the United States, I'm often thinking, what is it that is going to create a strong middle class 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, right? Not just today, but what are we doing to build that? How are we actually generating that? What is going to deliver that strength? And at this moment in human history, and you pointed out with all the technology charts, we now have this opportunity because of the technological change. Yep. And one thing that you didn't note on the technological change is that we have now shown, if you invest in it, and you create these markets, if you purposely do that, because a lot of those technologies were government-driven, government investment, government-created in large part, you can actually push down the cost curve by creating these new markets for things that matter. That's what you can do. How exciting is this new world where we manufacture energy and we are freed from the yoke around our collective necks of oil? Right? This is so exciting because it can free up every community all around the world to have access to power in a way that they can't now because they have to import it, right? But here's the thing. When we move to that new world, it's manufactured. Yes, there's minerals, and that we've got to think about critical minerals, but in large part, this is about manufacturing capacity, which is exactly what we have for so long decided wasn't the important part of our economy. We can export that, it doesn't matter, that's irrelevant, and yet I would argue that what we've seen over the past few decades, in large part, is that actually does matter, and I think in this new world, manufacturing will matter so much more. And we can have a longer discussion about that and why I think that is true. But as we're thinking about this economy moving forward and how we're going to deliver, we have to think about what are we going to do to shape our economic future? Will the United States be able to remain on the cutting edge, and I love saying this at Stanford, will we be able to remain on the cutting edge of the key technologies of the future? Will we be able to be globally competitive in them? Will we be able to create good jobs and the kind of investment that we need to see in critical sectors? Will we be able to create an economy that where Americans can afford things, where we can have economic security and affordability? And will we be able to have a government that can handle macroeconomic risk? Right? So we're starting this question about emissions, I think, with all of these big economic questions in front of us, and we're doing it after 50 years of rising economic inequality, across every axis. I did not bring charts. If I were to give you my chart deck, it would all be showing you about how we've seen a long-term shift in the profit share from wages to profits. We've seen this growing gap between productivity and wages. Between 1979 and 2025, productivity has grown by 90%, real wages only 33%. Somebody is getting the benefits, it's going to profits. Thomas Piketty's work and Gabriel Zuckman, Emmanuel Saez, all of these folks, and the long-term trends in inequality that we know have calcified into greater wealth inequality. Yes, people are angry. They're angry because if you were born in the decades right after World War II, 9 out of 10 of those kids grew up and they out-earned their parents. And we know from Raj Chetty's work that if you were born in the 1980s, only half of those kids grew up and out-earned their parents. People are frustrated. Their children are not having the same kind of upward mobility that we think they should have. And so now you want us to talk about emissions, right? And so you're starting from a place where the economy has been out of balance. And if you kind of go back to a very, and hopefully this will resonate for all of you non-economists in the room, if you go back to a very basic Econ 101 concept, you think about the 3 factors of production: capital, land, natural resources, and people. And when I think about those trends in inequality, what I see is a country, an economic system that has put a lot of weight on the capital leg of that stool, where that is where the income has gone, that is what the economy has really been benefiting. And what has happened is that you've seen the middle class weakened, starved in many ways. You've seen all of the effects that we know that have happened all across the country. And we've seen the degradation of our environment, and we've seen our failure to be able to cope with emissions. But if we start the conversation with emissions, I think we're losing the fact that the whole system has been set up to not benefit the people or natural resources side of that stool, but really to benefit the capital side. So what's gone wrong here? And as we're thinking about this new growth model, what do we need to reshape about our economic story? So that's my first comment. Second comment. You don't have much time as a discussant, so yeah. So here's the thing, and here's an argument that I have mostly with economists, but it'd be fun to have it with other people, but in the White House, among friends, I can't tell how many of economists have turned to me and said, Heather, and in fact it happened last night at dinner, where somebody just sort of, this assumption as economists that, but what's wrong? Why can't we just import all of the clean energy stuff? Like, why do we need to make it here? Why does that matter? And I am not, I did not spend my entire career at someplace like the Doris School. I'm not a climate person. I study labor and macro. But I think that we could all really take a beat and think about how important energy is. It is the foundation for what makes an economy grow. Without it, you can't make anything. You can't have a room that is heated. You can't get anywhere. Yes. The energy shapes the macroeconomic conditions. It shapes what we invest in. It shapes inflation and prices. It shapes the comparative advantage of countries. We know that part of the reason the United States was able to grow so far and so fast is because we had access to oil, to coal in the early years of economic development. We see this time and time again, but yet somehow when we're talking about climate and emissions, we lose the thread and we start thinking, well, this is something that just somebody else can do. And I think as a political economy question, this is something that we need to do. We are not going to be in a stable geopolitical environment if China, bless them, they're incredible, but if they are controlling upwards of 90% of the clean energy supply chain, that is not a stable geopolitical situation. And it's a monopoly. And we as economists, we don't like monopolies. Right? That's not going to be good for the world, because it's not good for anybody to have a bottleneck on something that everybody needs. I watch a lot of sci-fi, and they're always about energy. It's always about how you get energy. So for decades, we've had this model, and I'm gonna stop soon. For decades, we've had this model in the United States about how our economy could grow that I call placeless production. That we've had this set of ideas that and digitization made it possible to have the fancy engineers here in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto, and then the people that make things all over the world. And it didn't matter. And we lost a lot of things. We lost the connective tissue between what happens on the shop floor and what happens with the engineers. There's research on that. We lost agglomeration. We lost the power to make things. But at this moment, when we need to be able to figure out how to build those clean energy technologies, I think it is more important than ever that we connect the dots and we reject this idea of placeless production. And we come back to an idea that what we make profoundly and importantly matters. And so that is my just, a little bit of a twisting of the dial on your sets of ideas. And I will just, I have like this, I'm not going to do, I've got like a greatest hits of like 20 other comments, but now we get to talk. So, yes, I already went over my time. But now we get to talk for a while. So where would you like to start, Nick?
I've got to be careful not to be in violent agreement, but all the time. But I want to explain why I'm actually in violent agreement on the basic issues. We have to act on climate change because we have to act on climate change. If we don't bring down emissions sharply in the next 20 years, we'll have a world which, as I tried to describe, and this wasn't new, we mostly, I hope, know this, a world which would leave large areas basically uninhabitable. And you saw that whole belt of areas which, with in 2070, with 3.5 billion people, that could be close to uninhabitable. So it's an imperative, that action. The argument I've tried to offer, and it's crucial to the issues that you raised, this is an opportunity. And if the imperative to act on climate was actually going to, for the next 20 or 30 years, make most people in the world worse off in terms of living standards as conventionally measured, we would be in deep trouble. We're just in trouble, but we would be in deep trouble if the actions that we needed to stop these huge movements of people, with all the conflict that would come from it, if you had to persuade everybody that you've got to give up quite a lot for the next 20 years. So that's why this argument that it's both an economic imperative and an economic opportunity is so important. And why we have to win that argument, because if we don't, then this change won't happen, and we'll all be in terrible trouble. And we speak about the relationship between the generations. The next generation should never forgive us for that. So what you've emphasized is core to why I think we have to see it this way. And it's good that actually the economic arguments and facts point to this being right, because otherwise, so that's the second thing is to speak that development and growth need energy. By the way, I talk about development as applying to everybody, not just so-called developing countries. Development needs energy. That's absolutely crystal clear. But energy does not need emissions, and that's the whole point. That's the whole point of the argument. So that's the response on the energy side. Two other things quickly. It's very important, not simply from your idea of production and place, but from the point of view of the security of the world, that we have at least a few people making the critical stuff. We need a few people making cheap, we probably don't need several actually. We need enough for competition and enough for resilience, those two things. And this is a good economics research question, how many people making what do you need to give you sufficient competition and sufficient resilience? There are only two big-time airplane manufacturers in the world, right? I mean, Boeing and Airbus. It actually gives you some competition. Now, it would be nice if there were a couple more. But what I want to illustrate is that we have to be able to answer that question if we're thinking about a resilient world, as well as a competitive world that's going to help you bring down costs. How many do we need for panels, for batteries, for chips, actually for AI also? I think. We've only got two big ones at the minute, is China and the US. But in those key areas, can some of us, and you don't need everybody, can some of us, and Mark Carney makes that point, can some of us get together to try to make sure that we have enough producers of those key elements to give you both the resilience and the competition? It's a different argument from people and places, but it is associated with, it's another way of arguing that what the world needs is that kind of structures. And the last point would be around the service sector. Practically everybody in this room works in the service sector. The 80% of our economies are in the service sector. And increasingly, I find the distinction between manufacturing making stuff and activities making services is just too strong. I mean, the person who makes the TV helps, or the screen, and the person who makes the programs, they also help. The people who look after you in Stanford Hospital are using splendid machines, a lot of them made in Germany or wherever. I actually don't mind that, as long as they're really good at what they do. So I'm not a neurotic comparative advantage, just make one thing and buy everything else. Yeah? Security is, of course, something on that one, and communities grow around activities, and that's a very important, but Hollywood's a community, it grows around movies, right?
Agglomeration.
And so to think about activities in places does seem to me to be interesting and important, but insisting on that's manufacturing in places, I find a bit more difficult. But the crucial thing is the first two things I said. It's an economic imperative, it's an economic opportunity, and it better be if we're going to get anywhere on either of those things. And secondly, absolutely we need energy, but we really don't need the carbon.
Let me make two comments on that. On the latter one first, one of the things that we know is that, so if you look at the stats in the United States, we have seen the number of people who work in manufacturing decline, over time, consistently. That's both automation and trade, but largely automation. And yet, if you were to pair that with a chart of what our value added is in manufacturing, that hasn't actually declined. We actually still make a lot of things.
Yeah.
It just doesn't require a lot of people.
Sure.
And I think that's a really important distinction. So, what places make what a country makes? Is it about the jobs? Is it about the things? I think with energy, there is this, energy, maybe ships, maybe airplanes, like what is it that you think is really important? That some of that is going to be about the jobs, but a lot of it is going to be about the thing that it is actually creating and the community around that.
That's right.
And it's going to be about the R&D that's going into that industry. It's about being on the cutting edge of the innovation in that industry. I worry that because we've ceded the manufacturing of solar panels to China largely, are we still on the cutting edge of that technology, right? Are we like, somebody else is doing, like, how are we thinking about these? So I think it's important to kind of step back and not just see this as a jobs plan, but see it as actually the real world matters. The things that we make, how we make them, what kinds of communities they're embedded in, that matters as well. So I think that is really important on the manufacturing piece. Most of us are in services, and with the continued advancement, that's going to be the case. But where is the value added coming from? Where is how are we thinking about how those services are creating those good jobs? And you get some of that from those manufactured goods, right? Where you get those productivity increases. One thing that I do want to caution us against, just so when I started digging deep into this body of work, I found myself thinking a lot about the models, did a lot of work on the modeling questions, and there was a great joy actually in your conversation that you had up here, your monologue about the problems with the models. So just +1 on that. But the thing that I think has been really remarkable is that the climate community has done these models that have shown us through all of the different data that you've shown us that climate change is real and it's big and it's bad. And at some level, as an economist, I think I know pretty much all I need to know, which is we shouldn't be doing this and we need to take action. And the details are very important and other people should study that, but we know what we need to know to motivate our action. And then as you pointed out, we now know that a different world is possible. And I've been in conversations where those groups are getting together, the engineers and the climate people, and like, great, so let's solve the problem. And I think what you have been trying to bring into the conversation, what I'm trying to bring in the conversation, is that we actually need the people that think about human systems, because techno-optimism will only get you so far. That's just a fantasy, right? You can't make that happen unless you actually have the institutions, the planning, the people bought into these ideas. So in large part, I think our problem, and you've correctly identified it, the problem is how do we help people see this as something that's good for them, their family, their community? So it's got to be this growth story, and we can't get kind of lost in the idea that we can just have engineers in the room and they can solve the problem for us, but that we need to be having this bigger conversation. It's why I said yes, actually, to come and talk to you today. So.
Okay, thanks. The Leaf, we probably have to open this up pretty soon, but let me just say one thing about the technicalities of climate change. Yes, most people who've thought about this for more than 5 minutes recognize there's a real problem, but not enough people recognize the urgency of the problem. And not enough people recognize that the biggest part of this story is going to play through in the developing world. As I said, well over half of India's infrastructure that they'll have 25 years from now will be built between now and then. There are stronger statements about that. The statement in Africa would be bigger than that. This is a crucial period of time when the fraction of people living in cities is probably going to go up from the ballpark 55% it is now to something like 70% or more in mid-century, with most of that taking place in the developing world. This is the place where the action is most important. And one thing we could do as a world is to get together to make that easier. And low cost of capital is particularly important there. And that is something where you don't need everybody. You just need enough people who are ready to make that happen. And for most of the time, that's not Lady Bountiful doling out stuff. That's getting involved in the investment processes and the planning processes and so on in those countries. So when people talk about the technicalities of climate change, you all know what we have to do. I often miss the sense of urgency. This next 20 years are crucial. Yeah. And you often miss the understanding of where this thing is going to be so importantly driven.
One of the things that we got a lot of pushback in the White House on was that we were spending this money on investing in building a clean energy economy. And economists were really worried that we were crowding out other investment. To which my answer was always, and? Literally, what is more important? And you talked about how how the investment needs to increase. And I think, I would be curious, how you think about this idea, but what is more important than investing in these new clean energy technologies? And yes, hospitals are investing, yes, there are things that are, but there are other things that can wait 20 years, right? And I think we haven't encouraged our fiscal entities to really think long and hard about, no, this is the thing that we need to do now. And the other thing you haven't mentioned is how much rebuilding we're also going to be doing. Every fire, this is, this is a full employment program for construction workers for the next 20 years, because we need to build all this clean stuff, and every natural disaster requires construction workers to come in and clean it up and build new. And every time you do that is also an opportunity. to rethink this. But it's flipping the way that we think about budgeting and finance to think of this as an opportunity. A lot of lemonade.
Yeah, just one comment on it. Economists love to talk about trade-offs,
Yes.
a weight on this one versus a weight on that one. But what you've emphasized here, and what I tried to do also, is there's a logical ordering over time. And if you don't do this now, you're going to screw up so much
And we
down
can
the
have
track.
all this growth.
Absolutely.
So let's just do this thing now. I mean, just do it.
As a simple outsider and observer of the United States, I had the impression that was what the IRA was about.
That is 100% what it's about. And I've just given you, and all the people that critiqued us. But here we are. Yeah.
Thanks so much to Nick and Heather. It's time, friends, to open up the conversation for you. You'll see that there's microphones here and there. If you have a question, please just line up at the microphone. Since I am the faculty director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, I can remind us all that kindness and considerateness are two very strong ethical values, and I expect there'll be a lot of people who want to ask questions, so could you please confine yourself to a single brief question? By brief, I mean short, not long, compact. And by one, I mean a single question. If you have a second question coming on,
I don't know
if
about you,
there's a
Heather,
conjunction or a...
I would much prefer questions from that side, because looking this way is absolutely blinding.
Yeah.
Well, apparently the economists don't have questions.
Yeah.
It's all the non-economists. So please, would you start us out?
So a comment and a question. I thought you made an important distinction when you were talking about manufacturing in the U.S. At first it was like, wouldn't it be good for us to manufacture? Maybe, maybe not. I think the key issue from my perspective is the security one, that having any one country, particularly an adversary, is, a difficult issue. I'm curious about, no discussion about population and all the curves of, we know in Western Europe and in Africa, big dips. Is it because that time is well beyond the 20 years, so it's important, but it's too long of a time frame to really engage on what you were talking about, climate change?
Should we take a bunch of questions or do?
Go ahead for each one.
In most countries of the world now, population is falling, and the fact that it's rising very quickly in Africa does matter. There are all sorts of reasons for helping people manage the size of their family, in terms of women's rights, health of kids, and so on, which probably in the logic of the question come before climate change. So if we were discussing this 30 years ago, then you'd have found a lot of people in the audience saying the key thing is to limit population. I don't think that's an argument because of what's been happening to population that you would hear so strongly. But I do think that the changing structure of the world's population, and I tried to talk a little bit about the economic geography, will be very important in creating, for example, jobs in Africa. I mean, you've got a lot of young people coming through. Because of the lags, you've still got quite a lot of young people coming through in India, although the reproduction rate, the fertility rate now is already more or less below the replacement rate, but because of the age structure of the population, it's going to rise there. So I think creating these opportunities, I prefer creating opportunities to creating jobs, because labor is in a sense a cost if you're making things. We're talking about making opportunities. And I do think that these kinds of technologies, if applied well, the kinds of technologies we're talking about, will create a lot of opportunities for the younger people. And I say that's particularly relevant in Africa. But I think the population story in the United States is, or Europe or elsewhere, is the big issues are not really around climate. They're around the changing structure of the population, how you look after old people and so on, and that's a different kind of issue.
More specifically,
Can we just have, I'm sorry, we're going to have to go one.
Sorry, Heather, did you want to?
I'm okay. Let's go to the next.
Please.
I wanted to raise a specific point that I think sits at the nexus between the developing world emphasis and the domestic world emphasis, and that is carbon border adjustment mechanisms and ask about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't want you to talk about carbon tariffs, that are applied one direction and not the other. So I'm talking about the kind of thing that the EU is doing, but the good, the bad, and the ugly from both an economic and an ethical perspective.
Okay, so economist question there, CBAMs. So carbon border adjustments, the idea that if you have, if you do something, if you have a carbon tax to do something to lower emissions, that you don't want that leaked, you don't want then, other countries to be able to take advantage of that. So you are basically imposing that same tax on your imports. We spent a lot of time in the Biden administration working on this issue and thinking about how we would deal with the European Union. The first key tactic was to say one of the most important tradable goods in the world are steel and aluminum. They are very difficult to produce, they're huge capital investments, and they are very big emitters. And yet countries need them. If you want to build anything, you need steel. It's a national security issue. It's an economic security issue. And it's the big issue of contention between us and the Europeans. So instead of starting with this carbon border adjustment, let's start with our idea was let's start with bringing the Europeans and the United States together to come up with basically a club of two that could be expanded over time, but to say we're gonna have a race to the top in terms of clean steel and aluminum, and it's going to be a closed set in terms of what you can import. That to me felt like it was doing a couple of things. Number one, it was having a different conversation about trade, which has been a very challenging political issue. People are frustrated. One stat that I wanted to remark on, when you were saying something about the China shock, there are as many people working in the United States today in fossil fuel related industries as people who lost their jobs according to Otto Dorn and Hansen's work in the China shock. And that is just direct people. So when you think about the implications of switching, you've got a climate shock coming our way, which we need to do, but you have to think about it. And the trade issues are only going to add to people's anxiety. So thinking about something that moves beyond the old model and says, let's trade with like-minded countries on things that matter and have it be a race to the top is a different way of approaching it. Now, the Europeans didn't sign up in large part because they want their carbon border adjustment and they wanted us to do a carbon tax, and we're like, no, thank you. We're not ready for that. It's not happening. Also, have you heard of inflation? Because we've got inflation right now, so we're not going to raise taxes on energy. So those are my thoughts on where I think we need to go. I know people are talking a lot now about critical minerals. How do we create, standards and kind of races to the top? I think those are different ways to think about it.
I would just add one point. I've been in development economics all my life, and I think I've heard all the arguments for tariffs, and they're nearly all wrong. But this one has a logic. If something is coming into your country which has a cost much bigger than the cost that is charged because all these other things have not been charged, then there's a logic in saying that you're going to put a tariff on to pick up, because you want to get the incentives right, to pick up the damage that's done. Now, if that tax has already been levied in the country from which it's come, there's no need to do that. So there's a simple, basic environmental and trade economics argument for carbon border adjustment. The development economist in me, though, has seen that so much of this kind of thing is perverted. And if you make it complicated, if you make it apply to too many things, then the scope for protectionism to filter in is very big. So the Germans asked me to work a bit at their G7 a few years ago. And my advice was, yes, there's a logic here, but you only need to be talking about 4 or 5 goods. Mm-hmm. The rest is much smaller. And whatever you do, keep it simple. Because if it's a lot of goods and it's complicated, it's going to be twisted.
Well, and that was the argument about starting with the sectors that matter the most.
Quite
The other
right.
thing too, so, I mean, it's very difficult to measure the embedded carbon in something.
Yeah.
And so you're setting yourself up for a very challenging set of conversations and getting all up in other countries' business, right? What you really want are countries to build clean energy industries, and are you promoting that, or are you creating a full employment program for people that are monitoring your new system? I mean, I think that this simplicity question really needs to be more unpacked. We could spend the next hour on this topic. So
I'm just worried there's too much agreement here. This
well,
sounds
I
like
don't know.
everything is really smooth sailing. Does someone want to ask a question? We'll find some.
Yeah. First, a comment, and that was, remember when COVID came out, and then the location of the manufacturer of
Yes.
PPE was in China. It was that location where where initial COVID, right? So suddenly there was no PPE in the world because of that. So that's just, let's remember that. It makes sense to have manufacturing distributed.
Yes.
And likewise, I think we need to have distributed generation. Of course, my career has, the last gig I was at SunPower, which that was residential solar power. So I want that, but I think the problem is that the real participation in generation has been limited for like this distributed generation in the United States, at least, because there are basically stranded assets and people who control stranded assets. And we could even say that these wars, the recent wars, are all about what? Fossil fuel stranded assets. So I don't know if maybe we could comment on that.
Do you want to take the war first?
Heather and I spoke about, Heather spoke about places and manufacturing, and I gave a slightly different take on it, although not in logical contradiction, but a different perspective, which was the point you've just been making about resilience. And I would combine that with competition. You want both those things. So we do want multiple supplies of some things. Do we want multiple supplies of everything? I mean, there'll be areas where it doesn't matter so much, right? I mean, if we lose the ability to import oranges in the UK, then we can eat apples, you know. There's some areas where it doesn't matter very much. The areas we were talking about do matter a great deal because energy is so important. Vaccines, you know, one of the lessons of COVID is that it would be a good idea to have vaccines manufactured even more in the developing world. India does a lot, but not elsewhere, and you had this kind of vaccine apartheid associated with COVID. So I think it's important to think about which are the goods that really, really matter in terms of you need to be able to do it. Now, some people would say that the UK needs a steel industry. I don't think the UK needs a steel industry. We have very high energy costs in the UK, partly because we're not endowed very well. I mean, we're not in the Sun Belt, as some of you will have noticed, and that's where, you know, that's where the really low-cost energy is going to be. Will we, in a world, want to be fairly self-sufficient in vaccines? After seeing what happened in COVID, I would suggest that we do. So it's very important for a country, and it'll be different for different countries, to think through what it really means to think of a good as a strategic good. And I think that argument has to be made in terms of resilience and competitiveness.
And we have to have that conversation,
Yeah.
right? So from the perspective of economic policymaking, for the most part, the answer has been markets know best. and we don't need to be thinking about this, right? Placeless production, this is all fine, we're going to allow this to happen. I think what we are agreeing on is something actually quite different, quite new, quite challenging, which is we need to have a national conversation about what's important to make. I hope we do not enter the next pandemic without having a national conversation about vaccines, about face masks, about ventilators, right? The resiliency question, was so potent. And so, and then baby formula, right? There are all of these different things where you realize in a moment of crisis that they're made in one factory, or that you have this very fragile system because you've created these global supply chains that nobody knows really very little about, right? There's not like a master database that you don't know, right? And with climate change, what we do know is that there's going to be more weather-related disasters around the world. And so the idea that you have these fragile supply chains just in terms of transportation, right there, that's a risk. So how do you think about that just but that requires a massive rethinking, not massive, but for some people, rethinking of what the role of economic policymaking is. And I think it's to ask, what should we make in America? And how should that production happen? We've long talked about how. We talk about competition, we talk about labor standards, we've talked about environmental standards, we have all those regulations. But how do we think about the what and the how and make that a frontline goal? And if we do that, then energy is probably going to be number 1 or 2, right? It's going to be high tech and energy. Those are going to be the 2, right? Those are going to be 2 of the most important. And then you're going to have a bunch of services that are really important. But we haven't been having that conversation, and so we're sort of stuck on our heels, not knowing what we're doing.
Yeah, funny you mentioned that because that's my exact next question. So
Great.
Firstly, thank you for the engaging session. I'm Deepak. My background is in AI, so my question is going to be centered around AI. So I deeply appreciate your framework, like how you use low social discount to prove that aggressive climate action is totally irrational and it's needed and hand in hand with development. And I look closely at some of your work, like estimating that AI is overall net positive for transition, like something like it will offset, the amount it uses will be more than recuperated by what the savings it can bring. But the macroeconomic response to the risks of AI here is probably like carbon pricing and policies driving towards technical change in the market, where we force the free market to steer away from the bad kind of AI, like consumer AI or advertising, towards the good kind of AI that will kind of steer towards green optimization. But my concern is that AI's growth, like it's at an inflection point, and I think it might be outpacing the ability to implement those policies.
Yeah.
Like, to me, AI seems like a textbook example of Jevons paradox, where even though technology might be going down, the sheer explosion and widespread use of AI would kind of wipe out the gains that it would bring. And this is exacerbated by the geopolitical fragmentation that we're in, where the emphasis towards this green use of, or green optimization in AI may not be the heaviest right now, whereas the amount of AI growth is so high. So if we treat climate action as a calculated investment, my question is, how do we factor in this deviation from what AI could bring to us versus what currently is being spent on it? And if carbon pricing practically isn't fast enough to curb the Jevons paradox, then what kind of framework would you comment on or suggest such that we can actually rate or kind of estimate what is an allowed or regulated production amount for the AI that we should be doing?
Thank you for doing the reading and the thinking. There's a reference there to a paper that I and some colleagues published in Nature in the middle of last year around the potential contribution of AI to cutting emissions, and we put green and intelligent in the title, and we argued that if you look particularly at the application of AI to systems, cities, energy, transport, land, water. And of course, there's the systems that are made up of those subsystems. Then the potential for saving and making a much more efficient, cleaner set of systems like that is very large. And we put that together with one or two other things. Of course, AI's got great potential in discovery, whether it's AlphaFold or applying much more to nuclear fusion and so on. You know more about this than I do. But we try to do some simple sort of back of the envelope kind of numbers where we looked at the diffusion curves and asked how AI might be able to shift the diffusion curves in key technologies. And we looked at power, and we looked at artificial proteins, and we looked at road transport, which ballpark was about half the emissions. So we reckon that AI being applied in a really constructive way could probably save by 2035 around 5 gigatons. That's a lot, right? That's about half the difference from where we might be headed to where we need to be headed. And that was way more than the AI was ever going to use in 2035 for all the stuff that it does. So the question you pose, I think, is a very fair one based on what we wrote. A lot of AI has discovered that I'm an elderly gentleman who likes cricket, right? And it's not too difficult to discover, yeah? I mean, just look at my, anyway. And so it starts interrupting me when I'm going about my normal business with stuff, that happens to all of you, right? I mean, it finds out who you are and it starts interrupting you. And for me, that's negative value added. Mm-hmm. They're interrupting me. So the trouble is that the revenue model is associated with advertising, and it's really bound into advertising. The revenue model I'm talking about here is a whole city functioning much better, or a whole energy system. So what we've got to do is to create the clients. The clients are not just simply a bunch of different consumers. They are actually, as you were saying, they're communities, they're geographies, they're cities, and so on. And that means that if we want the AI to shift over to where it's most productive, we have to have active public policy. The cities of the world could get together, and they may not, because it's going to cost something, but they could get together and become a big client. And that's an example of the kind of social action which, and public policy, it doesn't quite capture all this. It's how you build the coalitions, how you build the clients. That's the kind of way, but we have to shift it in that direction because the potential productivity is so high. And it's not just the emissions. A lot of this works through just sort of bog standard efficiency, right?
Yeah. I would add, we also, there's a lot of talk right now in communities across the country about regulating it, not wanting a data center or thinking about electricity. One of the things about electricity is that it's very, the way that people get their electricity is very disparate. It's all around the country, right? And there's not like one sort of system, right? They're all kind of bespoke in their own way. But one of the things that utilities have to give electricity, and that's very different than with water, where you have some rationing that happens. And electricity, it's just about the price, which gets to the Jevons paradox issue. And with AI, should we be having a different, I don't know, I'm not the expert here, and I know other people know far more than I do, but to me, I'm starting to have real questions. Well, why do we do it that way? Maybe we should, we set up these systems, a century ago. Maybe we should be rethinking how we are treating these clients. And I worry a lot about the opportunity cost. AI is taking energy, who's not getting it? So what kind of manufacturing or other important use isn't getting it because they can't afford it or because it's physically not there? So, but I think a lot of that is local utility regulation, and there seems to be a lot of appetite for that right now. Above and beyond all the other things that we need to do.
Thank you.
Friends, we have 6 minutes left, so perhaps we could group the next 2 questions and then see how we go, please.
Sure, thank you so much. You spoke about the 20 years to an emergency situation where we have a lot of data that indicates this is going to be a real emergency in 20 years. And then you very well thinking about how to galvanize for the solution, reference the middle class and the need to really galvanize the middle class if we're going to have a solution. And when I think of that, I guess my question, maybe this is not a question for an economist, but I will ask it is, what is the definition of an emergency? Because most in the middle class would not describe a problem that has a 20-year time horizon as an emergency. We have other problems as middle class people. And so does the language that we use sometimes to describe the problem get in the way of our ability to solve the problem?
Yes, and that's why you have to, sorry.
This will be easy. It's somewhat related. So I'm obviously a very huge fan of your work, and my question picks up on where your conversation ended, which had to do with the trade-off. So I'm very much on board with the climate action and development, no trade-off. But then I think in particular contexts, that trade-off starts getting very acute, especially when you start bringing in the extreme risk economics piece. So for instance, would a country buy very expensive catastrophe insurance with premiums or invest in development, mitigation, or adaptation? So I think in those contexts, that trade-off does get very acute, and I'm wondering, for a young scholar, I'm in the Door School, what kind of frameworks you see opening the doors for policy making and decision making in those particular types of contexts, since it goes beyond the expected utility framework.
Nick, go first. I'll let you
Are you going to take any more questions? Or?
Let's see how we go.
Okay. On the emergency story, the emergency on action is now. Yeah. If you drop a lead weight off the, whichever building you choose as your high building, Empire State Building, it takes a while to hit the floor. But when you've dropped it, the emergency has begun, right? And so what we're talking about here is that these effects that are going to make life intolerable for so many people 20 or 30 years down the track are affected now. I mean, it's a bit like if trucks started running down kids in the road today, people would call that an emergency. But actually the same thing is happening. It's simply that the kid gets knocked over 20 years from now as a result of the action you take today. And it's that kind of discussion that we have to have as a world. I don't think that's impossible, but it's a real difficulty because of those lagged effects. But that's the kind of thing we have to face up to, right? I mean, it's in the logic of the problem. On the trade-offs, I was trying to argue that there's no big super trade-off between climate action over here and growth and development over there. There really isn't, for all the reasons I tried to articulate. But there's some very big choices that we have to make. I've argued that we have to increase investment. So there'll be some places in the world where there's Keynesian deficient demand, and that if you increase demand through increasing investment, then output goes up and actually consumption would go up. But there are many places where that's not true. And so we're going to have to make the choice to consume a little bit less now and invest a bit more. And that will drive growth, and it'll bring down emissions, and it'll have those effects. So I don't want to say that there are no trade-offs. They're big. I prefer to use the language of choices. And then you have to identify what choices you have to make. If you invest in a house, you cut your consumption for a bit, but you're actually better off because you've invested in the house and you know it's going to give you those returns down the track. So it's identifying the right kind of choices that we have to make. And that's going to turn on how you specify the technology and the economics and the way you write down the problem which is associated with growth and emissions. So think carefully about the problem you write down before you jump into the policy. But do jump into the policy, yeah.
So, yeah, and a couple of comments on both of these. I think some of implicit in your question too is that there are fiscal constraints on what we're spending money on, and we're going to have a national conversation about that as well. Like, we are in a very budget constrained world by design in many ways, and yet we are going to need to be spending. And so how are we going to get ourselves through that pickle? We could I don't know, tax AI. They seem to have a lot of money, but figure out, like, what are we going to do to either be okay with more debt or figure out how we're going to raise taxes. And so there are some trade-offs there as well that it sounds like you're not doing economics, but I just wanted to throw that in there. On this question over here, I think that the answer is, I think that people don't, they see this as an emergency when it's happening to them. I think that what people, I think a lot of it is about US competitiveness. How do we help people? I don't think it's hard for people to understand that right now, other countries, particularly China, are just kicking our butt on things that matter. And that's incentivizing. I live in a country where people are really competitive, use some sports metaphors, right? It doesn't have to be mean. It doesn't have to be like they're our enemy, but like they are winning at a bunch of things that we could also be doing. And it feels like there's a healthy, competitive race to the top kind of ethos. I think what's really important about that is that the rest of the world has got the memo that clean energy is where we are going to win the future. And we're stuck saying, no, we're going to stay here in the past. But I think that the trick will be to help people see, no, actually, if you want to sell 1 billion cars, you need to make them phones with wheels, right? That's what, these cars are amazing. Why are we not doing that? Like, we can do that. But it requires, I think, sort of reshaping to understand that we've had moments in American history when we've thought, oh, these other countries are really winning on something that we want to be competitive in, and that feels more aspirational to me than the disasters, and it gets you to the same outcome, and it's tied to communities wanting to have something that they can believe in, that they can do and participate in, that can help win the future.
Yeah. As I invite Professor Levin to give some closing remarks, let me apologize so much to people who didn't have a chance, but the happy reminder is tomorrow at 10 a.m. in this building will be part 2 of Professor Stern's presentation, and that will be something we're all looking forward to, tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Great, so I have the honor of wrapping this up. Please join me in thanking Professor Nicholas Stern and Heather Boucher once more. It was a terrific discussion, and really appreciate the visionary lecture and the great discussion and occasional disagreement, but also close alignment in many of your remarks. As Leif just said, the second part of the Tanner lecture is tomorrow. It's at 10 a.m. It's going to be a different format. So tomorrow will be a discussion seminar, and Professor Stern will be joined by 2 discussants, Simon Caney, who's professor of political theory at the University of Warwick, and Gretchen Daly, who's professor of environmental science here at Stanford. And that will be I think just across the hall, actually, in the other room at Denning House, and hope to see many of you there. And thank you all for joining this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, John.